Ma no. Ma no, tanto loro cosa dice questa cosa? Non so se abbiamo fatto. Ci siamo incontrati. Ci siamo incontrati alla sua porta. Esatto.
Alô? Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas. Vamos começar então o evento de hoje. Nós temos o prazer e a honra de receber mais uma vez o professor Jacopo Galimberti, do IUAV de Venezia, para aquilo que vai ser a sua última palestra aqui conosco. Ele está passando aqui um curtinho período de visitante na Unicamp, e vai hoje nos apresentar essa conferência Housewives Against Housework, Millie Gandini from the Wages for Housework Campaign to the Socialist Party, que trata da relação de uma artista com o movimento operaísta e o movimento feminista pelo salário doméstico. O professor Jacopo Galimberti, professor na Universidade de Veneza, é autor de já alguns bons livros, como esse último livro, Images of Class, sobre o qual ele vai falar hoje também. Autor antes também de um belíssimo livro sobre coletivos de artistas, intitulado Individuals Against Individualism, de 2017. E, enfim, um ótimo colega, que estou muito feliz de receber aqui na Unicamp. Tenho certeza que essa última fala dele vai ser a oportunidade para mais um ótimo debate com todos nós. Jacopo, grazie mille di essere qua. Poi.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Gabriel, and for you. Thank you for being here today. So, let me see. Where's the PDF now? Okay. Can you see? Okay, so in my book, I focus on architects and visual artists who use the ideas and struggles of operaismo and autonomia to produce works, architectural projects, and to rethink their practice. And one chapter is devoted to Gruppo Immagine, a group of 4 feminist artists and 1 architect who were part of the Wages for Housework campaign. Gruppo Immagine literally means image group, and this group was unique in the way it combined feminism, Marxism, and a focus on images. I will first concentrate on this group, and then on the path taken by one of its members, Millie Gandini, who passed away in 2017. So let's just start with, this is the group Immagine and Millie Gandini in the 70s, of course. To clarify the political approach of Group Immagine, I would like to begin by discussing a poster they designed for the 1978 national gathering of the Wages for Housework campaign. The slogan reads, "Money to all women." The poster posits an identity between the Venus symbol and money, coins, soldi. While the image establishes a visual dialogue with the symbol of the campaign, a clenched fist clasping banknotes, as you can see, the conflation of Group Imagine's posters seems odd, as the slogan reads "Money to all women," not that women are money. Yet, Group Imagine was in fact illustrating a key idea of the campaign. The poster signals that housework and the labor of love, be it caring for partners, children, or elderly parents, is a commodity. In the arcane of reproduction, so let me see, yeah, okay, I'll go back to that image. In the arcane of reproduction, house workers, sex workers, workers, and capital, Leopoldina Fortunati, one of the campaign's theories, spoke in terms of the dual character of social reproduction. Social reproduction is a commodity, without which labor power cannot exist. But at the same time, it is cast as natural, intrinsic to women, remunerated by love and affection, as it were. However, one should not misunderstand the Wages for Housework campaign as a mere demand for money. In the pamphlet, Counter-Planning from the Kitchen, Silvia Federici and Nicole Cox explained that it was more accurate to describe this international campaign as against rather than for housework. Indeed, its ultimate goal was to raise the cost of labor power, and diminish the divisions between wage workers and those whose work was not remunerated. In Italy, the campaign saw housewives as part of the non-remunerated segments of the working class, partly because the economic condition of Italian women had worsened. While in Northern Europe, women, I don't know about Brazil, could be interesting, were increasingly present in the labor market. In Italy, the percentage of women in this sphere decreased between 1959 and 1973. Mainstream historical narratives concentrate on the fact that the Italian economic boom saw an expansion of the industrial sector in the 60s. But what is often overlooked is the fact that the data indicates that this trend concealed a parallel process of housewifeization, so to say. Working class women doing piecework at home, but also working in agriculture and in the service industry, not only moved from the south of Italy to the north, but also from precarious employment to the household, becoming full-time housewives. So let's look again at the poster. Encoded in it is a critique of the visual culture of the revolutionary left, which was often hinged on the value of uniformity. Here, the image depicts a demonstration informed by diversity. No two symbols are exactly alike. From an iconographic perspective, the serpentine demonstration is connected to a symbol of affluence and nourishment, the cornucopia, a horn that spills over with either money or produce, and which is often carried by a female figure. In light of this reference, it is possible to return to Fortunati's book and argue that the image on the poster embodies the dual character of social reproduction, both a commodity, money, and a supposedly natural source of wealth. The members of Group Immagine were all based in Varese, a town located not far from Milan. They were not a group of working class housewives, yet they felt oppressed, controlled, and forced to neglect their interests for the putatively greater good of the family. The group's founder was Milli Gandini, who around 1974 began to meet the Paduan militants of Lotta Femminista, a component of which was found in the Italian contingent of the Wages for Housework campaign. Some of Lotta Femminista's leaders, such as Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Fortunati, were based in Padua and had been members of Potere Operaio before launching Lotta Femminista in 1971. Potere Operaio was plagued by male chauvinism, and this was a crucial factor in the split. However, the conceptual frameworks of the two groups had common origins, operaismo, a strand of Marxism, and with hindsight, they can be construed as complementary. Both Lotta Femminista and Potere Operaio saw the wage as a terrain of conflict. They both advocated class autonomy for trade unions and parties. They both saw wage labor as alienating rather than emancipating. And its militants praised the strategic refusal of work as a way to counter the cult of work professed by the institutional left. Just like Lotta Femminista, Potere Operaio focused on the social factory, the locus where capitalism extracted surplus value from forms of knowledge, work, and cooperation that were located outside the factory premises. Potere Operaio spoke in terms of internal colonization, that is, the extension of capitalist relations of production to regions of the world, social groups, and aspects of human life that were not, strictly speaking, capitalist. By the same token, lots of feminists observed that women's labor power, just as well as that of small farmers and shepherds in southern Italy, for example, or areas of Asia and Africa, was subject to this process of internal colonization. Therefore, the idea that women should enter the labor market, a mainstay of second-wave feminism, was not regarded by the campaign as a progressive aim per se. However, whereas Potere Operaio upheld operai, industrial workers, a lot of feminists are concentrated on house workers. This was the title of their periodical. Let me see if I have it here. Yeah, you have it, the periodical on the right-hand side. Le operaie della casa, so basically house workers. In 1975, Le operaie della casa described Gruppo Immagine as the Varese-based section of the campaign for wages for housework, and advertised an exhibition entitled La Mamma è uscita, Mom has gone out. Written by Gandini, the text stated that the exhibit served the need to communicate the messages of the Wages for Housework campaign. For example, the tapestry were described as a, quote, negation of what embroidery has traditionally represented for women, a great deal of manual and repetitive work carried out with very small stitches. Instead, these tapestries are not only conceived and executed by a woman, but because they express the struggle against domestic and extra-domestic work, they are made with very large stitches. Here, the embroidery is reduced to a minimum, and the design stems from a refusal of the traditional idea of embroidery, unquote. Here, Gandini used the technique of cross-stitch, but subverted it, transforming it into something unrefined and gross. I'll come to that image in a minute. As Rosika Parker has demonstrated in The Subversive Stitch, the hierarchical distance between crafts and fine arts was a major factor in the marginalization of women's work. In the case of Gandini, the sabotage of the traditional stitch was directed against the deceitful idea that good quality needlework embodied a positive moral message per se and the performance of feminine virtues. The text published in Operaie della Casa also mentioned the presence of sealed pots, colanders with false holes, symbols of feminism written in the dust. These objects emphatically refused housework and evoked, quote, the ridiculous backwardness of the housework's technological level, unquote. This was a feminist appropriation of an operaista leitmotif. Technology is never a neutral force. It is informed by political choices and evolves mostly under the pressure of social struggles. Mom has gone out shares little with what may be called activist art today. Gandini's sealed pots were presented as artworks. In fact, some militants criticized the exhibition as a way of taking advantage of the movement, of the social movement. This objection failed to take into account that leaving the house to meet fellow artists or activists, cultivating one's own interests, traveling in order to exhibit, these were all liberties that the Gruppo Immagines members often struggled to obtain from their partners. Gandini's partner, for instance, was a physically abusive breadwinner who felt entitled to have some control over her intellectual positions, friendships, and appearance. As in the case of the poster, the group made a few prop works for the Wages for Housework campaign. This banner was at the meeting of the Wages for Housework campaign in 1976 and approximates what today is often called activist art. On the fabric, the group inscribed a Latin litany that is recited after the prayers of the Rosary in the Catholic tradition. In this case, the sentence reiterates, like a mantra, the attributes of the Holy Mary. The mantra sounds a bit like Mater castissima, Mater inviolata, Mater prudentissima, Mater amabili, Mater boni consigli, which is transcribed on the fabric. Mary is described as pure, in Latin, of course, immaculate, merciful, and thoughtful mother. Most of the Gruppo Immagines members had a Catholic upbringing, and the Holy Virgin had been presented to them as the ultimate example of femininity. The Catholic Church, with its reactionary position on divorce and abortion, was one of the main adversaries of Italian feminists. On the banner, larger letters are played against this backdrop made of incantatory repetitions. They read, "Even love is housework," one of the slogans of the campaign. Group Imagine's banner embedded the campaign within the history of women's oppression. Through this object, the protest songs were juxtaposed with a tradition in which religious chants, much like Grandini's embroidery, were not only a form of artistic expression, but also a social practice that was implemented to instill obedience and acquiescence in women. The group's most important exhibition was the collective show at the 1978 Venice Biennale. However, something of great consequence happened in 1977, the 1977 movement, which is unique to the Italian context. What was the 1977 movement? Let me be a bit provocative. 1977 was the first political movement of precarious workers. Its social origins date back to the oil crisis of 1973-1974, which generated unprecedented rates of unemployment and a definitive break, at least in Italy, with the political hegemony of the male factory worker. New political frameworks emerged, including environmentalism and the LGBT movement. And new networks came to the fore, such as the Circles of Proletarian Youth and the Metropolitan Indians. The spirit of 77 informed the text that the Group Imagine presented a Woman, Art, Society, a meeting they co-organized in January 78. The group recanted its previous forms of political commitment, explaining that it was just another form of repression, this time self-inflicted. Gandini and her peers praised the useless as opposed to the direct utility champion, but what they called the red asceticism of militant art. The Group Imagine insisted that the correct political perspective was that of the Wages for Housework campaign, yet now, they argued, they wanted Wage to be able to focus on art. The group provocatively demanded Wages for Housework as an allowance, enabling them to pursue an artistic career. Yes, they said, we want to be artists and to be famous. In so doing, however, they depicted gender parity, competing on equal economic terms with male artists, as a pressing political objective. The members of Group Imagine were rebuked by participants in the meeting who embodied the radicalism of the 1977 movement, while Group Imagine advocated an increased female presence in the culture industry. The majority of the women in the audience were wary of these slightly older feminists who were, for them, way too eager to make it into the system. Group Imagine's praise of professionalism was related to its upcoming exhibition at the Venice Biennale. The theme of the 1978 Venice Biennale was from nature to art, from art to nature. Group Imagine designed a space that articulated this dichotomy as dialectical. Nature, or rather its reproduction, was relegated outside of the group's exhibition space, which was delimited by a panel whose exterior side was covered with postcards reproducing a natural element such as the moon or a forest. The group explicated that by locating nature outside, they wanted to reject the idea that women could embody nature. At the same time, nature was present in the installation. After they had walked around the panel, visitors entered the main exhibition space to discover a pool full with water. At a time when debate about abortion was raging in Italy, this area, which the group dubbed historical space, enacted, they wrote, the control of nature. The exhibits consisted of 5 lengths of cloth that were hung above the pool so that their images were reflected into the rippled surface of the water. Nature was again kept at bay from the works, as water was here understood as a shared mirror. Instead of being an analog for motherhood, the liquid in the pool, a nod to amniotic fluid, was presented as the locus where the 5 length of and the personalities they expressed their request, summoning up images of dissolution. A political phase was ending. Although Group Imagine pursued its work until the late 80s, its members put increasing amounts of energy on their individual careers. In the book, I analyze some of these lengths of clause, but today I want to devote the final part of my talk to Gandini's trajectory after 1978. That year, abortion was declared legal in Italy, and this victory marked a phase of gradual institutionalization of feminism. The feminist agenda and its cultural heritage are penetrating politics and the institutions, Marina Zancan argued in 1981. Yet this shift often thwarted the more radical aspects of feminism. Quote, "We are increasingly trapped into," this is again Marina Zancan, "into a discourse that neutralizes feminism, presenting it as a new cultural trend," unquote. In the early 80s, Gandini framed the tensions inherent to production as a cultural neutralization of feminism. Although she claimed a less militant and more cultural approach, this was not without paradoxes, Gandini herself observed. Indeed, a female artist operated in a hostile milieu of men that had appropriated female creativity for centuries. In a 1981 text, she bitterly commented, quote, "I live among thieves. In the warehouses of culture, loot has been piled up for centuries. By law, if I take a dress to the laundrette and do not pick it up, it becomes the property of the launderer. This is what happened. Women did not take back their clothes. In the cultural field, women introduced lightness, irony, they de-dramatize. This largely coincides with what has been called postmodern. I would venture," this is again Gandini, not me, "that the postmodern movement can be read as feminine, even though, once again, male architects and artists have picked up and translated our ideas and methods into their own," unquote. In the 90s, in a 90s book called After la Dolce Vita, Alessia Ricciardi argues that lightness, weakness, sweetness, and softness were the semantic areas within which postmodernism was negotiated in Italy. If we agree with Gandini's analogy, Ricciardi's book indirectly confirms her early assessments. The link between feminism and postmodernism begs a further question. To what extent did a diluted form of feminism foster the emergence of neoliberalism? In Fortunes of Feminism, Nancy Fraser addressed this point. She contended that the new spirit of capitalism of the 80s fed on the anti-economicism of factions of the feminist movement, and namely on its tendency to regard the ingress of female labor into the market as feminist per se. Gandini's series from 1979 reflects the growing contradiction between her allegiance to the Wages for Housework campaign and her willingness to see the market as a conduit for female emancipation. Against a white background enhancing the loneliness of the figures, Gandini reproduced famous nudes by Renoir, Degas, Barlach. Here the crosses were not stitched but rather drawn. Signaling a departure from a previous approach, Gandini's stitches now instantiate a signature style transcending the material culture, embroidery, that had motivated their emergence in her mid-70s work. The titles, I Remember Renoir, I Remember Barlach, should be read as a sentence uttered by the model. The sitters cannot escape the artist's erotic gaze, but Gandini points to their condition as workers, models, whose subjectivity is concealed, as in I Remember Renoir, precisely by the total exposure of her body, notably via the idealization immanent to the nude as a genre. Gandini further explored the critical possibility of an encounter with male artists in 1982. For an exhibition, she asked 10 male colleagues, including Bruno Munari and Enrico Bai, to present her work, which outlined gloomy tablecloths with tassel, Chippendale-style chairs and kitsch floral tapestry, glimpses of those buone cose di pessimo gusto, described in Gozzano's poem L'amico di nonna Speranza, a very Italian literary reference, an author you read also in high school, very popular in Italy. Confined in a metal cage, Gandini's crammed interiors convey the horror vacui with which the early 20th century bourgeois, according to Walter Benjamin, sought to preserve a simulacrum of interiority and individuality, whose conditions of possibility, he felt, were threatened in the context of the metropolis. Gandini's claustrophobic room suggests that what preserved the bourgeois illusion of interiority was, in fact, an excruciating female labor that generations of women had shouldered. One of the most accomplished works from this phase is Vestire la nuda veritas, which was exhibited in Vienna in 1983. In the catalogue, Gandini relied on Massimo Cacciari's philosophical book Crisis to outline an analogy between the 80s and the slow decay of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The exhibition marked a further step towards Gandini's disenchanted embrace of the art world. If in 1981, in the quote I mentioned earlier, culture was still a den of thieves who extracted knowledge from women, now culture turned into a shelter. Quote, can culture and art be a shelter? It would seem so at the time when the increased cultural consumption evokes the ineffable feeling that the artists of turn-of-the-century Vienna interpreted as presaging the dissolution of the world. Today, it is possible to look at Klimt, so a male artist, of course, as a wistful, disenchanted, and anguished interpreter of utopia and its presumed end. With great respect and awe, Klimt depicts the radicality, wrath, and struggle of women, notably in the Furies and Jurisprudence, rebellious against the law, ruthless and cruel. Their instincts prevail over politics, unquote. How did Gandini earn a living in the early 80s? I think this is a very important question, always. She was in charge of public relations at FAP, a company that manufactured plastic objects and was interested in increasing business in both the private and public sectors. So the reasons for her taking on this role are to be found in the networks she had built up since the late 70s. Her cultural and political activism had provided her with considerable cultural capital, which included acquaintances in the Socialist Party. Gandini's daughter would soon start working with Gianni De Michelis, the Minister of Labour in the mid-80s. Sorry, this is Klimt's Furies and the Jurisprudence. De Michelis and Francesco Forte, the Minister of Finance, are among the protagonists of a series of paintings that Gandini dedicated to powerful men who frequented her home. These public figures were always depicted seated on a sofa, were for Gandini a powerful demonstration of how she had progressed from a housewife's life to an independent existence in less than a decade and despite a divorce. Gandini was now far from the perspectives of the Wages for Housework campaign. Nonetheless, the series articulated a sort of feminist critique. The sitters were dethroned, fully clothed, but no less vulnerable than Renoir's model. They were exposed, and it was a woman who shaped the image of their bodies and did so in a domestic space that belonged solely to her. Consider Forte's portrait. The minister has sleepy eyes and his hair is disheveled, yet he holds his drink as if he were a scepter like a king. The point of view would be that favored by the authorities from below, but the choice is deliberately inappropriate as it foregrounds Forte's thigh. Rather than the iconography of sovereignty, the portrait recalls the languid and tipsy sex workers lounging on Toulouse-Lautrec's sofas. The female nude above the minister's head is a self-portrait of Gandini. Her body, but not her face, also appears in the portrait of De Michelis, where the artist, wearing a mini skirt and a top with a thin strap delicately falling down her arm, evokes a central atmosphere. Like Forte, De Michelis is satirized. Sprawled on the sofa, the overweight body of the minister is echoed by blue elephants in the background. These are absent from the photograph used to make the painting, suggesting that the sarcasm of the juxtaposition is deliberate. The two portraits are traversed by ambivalent feelings, complicity and criticism, intimacy and repulsion. For all the subversion of the relationship between a painter and his model, the faceless women are still present as erotic objects in these works. The idea of placing famous men on a couch later became a leitmotif of Gandini's work. But it's now time to conclude. I'll try to wrap up some of the core points I try to raise. The feminism of our present time also frames its challenges in terms of social reproduction and of division of labor on a world scale. So it is important to reconsider the current of second wave feminism that provide the movement with the materialist dimension and engage precisely with some of these questions, in my view. Over the past 15 years, the reassessment of figures such as Silvia Federici, Leopoldina Fortunati, Dalla Costa, and many more is the result of this widespread awareness. In this respect, the study of the group imaginary not only opens up innovative vistas on the 70s history of art and feminist movement, but it also offers an opportunity to connect past struggles with the immensely more visual landscape of contemporary protests. In my book, you will find more about the group's projects. Today, I've decided to focus on Gandini as her trajectory presents an interesting case study of what might happen after a phase of intense political activism. How can some powerful feminist demands be institutionalized? What are the risks, contradictions, but also possibilities, of course, imminent to the institutionalization? What did a post-feminist art look like in 1980s Italy? Here, I've tried to provide some answers, but some topics still deserve further analysis. For example, the artistic and cultural agenda of the Socialist Party in the 80s, Italian feminism and postmodernism, but also Achille Bonito Oliva's trans avant-garde or the groundbreaking architecture biennale of Pier Paolo Portoghesi in 1980, the first architecture biennale, cannot be fully understood without investigating the role of the Italian Socialist Party. If Portoghesi was a prominent figure of the party, Bonito Oliva, Renato Barilli, and Carlo Ripa di Meana, the director of the Biennale in the 70s, were themselves party members. So too like Gandini, who ran for the elections in Milan shortly before the dissolution of the Italian Socialist Party due to its endemic corruption. You can see the images here. Gandini, the artist for the Socialist Party. There's a list of artists, and she's one of them. Last but not least, my focus on Gandini is also a way to complicate our historical narrative. Carla Lonzi and different feminism, which was no doubt pioneering, but was not the only current to inform feminist artists in Italy. As I've shown in my book, some members of the Wages for Housework campaign articulated a tentative aesthetic discourse, but it is now time to come to a close and to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacopo, for this very inspiring presentation with a lot of new material, I believe, for most of people who are here today. Eu já deixaria aberto para perguntas, se for necessário, né, como acontece frequentemente, que quem está na mesa faça a primeira pergunta, até as pessoas terem coragem de perguntar, eu faço. Mas se não for necessário, eu já passo o microfone. Acho que hoje, com a presença aqui do nosso grupo de estudos, não vai ser necessário, não? Ou vai? Sempre bom que a primeira pergunta. Deu para acompanhar bem, né? Seria uma boa pergunta também, né? Acho que Nós temos aqui alunos de graduação e de pós. Tem várias questões aqui que foram tratadas. Vou fazer, é isso que eu estou fazendo nesse momento. Eu pensei, lembrei disso, imagina. Ele passou aqui, acho que por diversas questões que não são tão óbvias para nós, né? Agora depois melhor, né? Como eu disse antes, o trabalho mais recente do Jacopo é sobre a relação das artes visuais com o movimento operaísta italiano, nas décadas de 60 e 70, até a década de 80. E hoje ele falou mais especificamente dessa artista, Amelie Gandini, que é uma artista que, eu vou até pedir para ele comentar isso aqui, mas eu já adianto, né? Deixa ele comentar depois, mas ele me contou um pouco do quanto ele contribuiu aqui para a retomada da história dessa artista, que até o Jacopo começar as pesquisas dele sobre esse assunto estava praticamente esquecida mesmo. Então, é um material bastante novo. Então, essa artista que trabalhou primeiramente ligada, então, ao movimento operaísta e à campanha pelo salário doméstico, né? Isso que ele está sendo chamado aqui de wage for housework, né? E com essa ideia, é bom sublinhar isso para a gente, funciona da mesma maneira, né? Essa palavra que ele está usando aqui em inglês, housework, né? Vocês viram que o título da publicação do grupo, que agora eu perdi aqui, usava a palavra operai, né? Então, le operai della casa, né? Então, eram de fato as operárias da casa. A palavra é a mesma palavra que nós temos em português, portanto, que salienta essa dimensão do trabalho na sua maneira mais propriamente ligada ao trabalho sobre o capitalismo moderno, né? Então, a ideia de que, assim como há o operário na fábrica, há uma operária em casa que permite que exista o operário na fábrica, né? Então, essa função social do trabalho doméstico como parte complementar da reprodução social do trabalho sobre o capital. Então, se a gente pensar que o movimento operaísta é justamente um esforço de reelaboração teórica para entender as reacomodações da reprodução capitalista no contexto do pós-guerra e do milagre econômico do pós-guerra, né? Então, com uma grande discussão para tentar entender qual a função que tem todo o setor terciário e esse alargamento do trabalho para fora da fábrica, né? Nessa sociedade de serviços que vai se constituindo a partir da década de 60, não surpreende que esse movimento tenha um desdobramento no âmbito da reflexão sobre a atividade doméstica, como também uma das vertentes do alargamento do trabalho para além do espaço da fábrica, e que nomeie esse trabalho doméstico como um trabalho similar ao fabril, né? Então, quanto uma outra forma de operário, né? De operário. Mas ele contou aqui para nós também, então, desse primeiro momento, da década de 60 da década de 70, em que essa militância está ligada à demanda pelo salário doméstico, mas foi mais além para colocar algumas questões que aparecem a partir aí de uma virada chamada de virada pós-moderna da arte e de uma incorporação dessa artista e desse grupo ao cenário artístico e cultural, né? Como isso aparece com as suas contradições e lutas, né? Então, uma demanda, né, por entrar no circuito artístico como algo que salienta a desigualdade de gênero no circuito artístico e cultural, mas como isso também implica algumas contradições do ponto de vista de uma proposta inicialmente radical que tem que agora se conformar com acomodações de institucionalização. Na verdade, ele deixou essas questões mais em aberto, né? Agora no final, apontando para que justamente tipos de problemas que a gente teria que pensar a partir de histórias como essa seriam justamente as contradições que emergem de demandas institucionais e suas acomodações institucionais, por exemplo. Outra menção que acho que foi bastante importante aqui foi o movimento de 77. Eu não sei o quanto vocês conhecem o movimento de 77 na Itália, né? Mas então a gente tem um movimento social e contracultural forte em 68 na França e em diversos países. A gente tem talvez um novo capítulo desse movimento com uma outra potência em 77 na Itália. E ele chamou aqui esse movimento provocativamente do primeiro movimento dos trabalhadores precários. Eu vou pedir para que ele comente melhor isso depois, né? seria outro ponto. Eu vou fazer uma pergunta também sobre a Bienal de Veneza, talvez a Gabi queira fazer uma pergunta sobre a Bienal de Veneza também. E, bom, grosso modo é isso, né? Eu acho que o resumo, assim, dos pontos principais que eu marquei aqui ao longo da fala dele para que eu pudesse resumir para vocês foram esses. E esse último ponto agora que está bem no final, né, da fala, é a relação dessa artista com o Partido Socialista Italiano, né? Aí seria todo um outro capítulo. Ele falou que teria que ser pensado, né, entender também esse momento final da carreira dela na relação com uma proposta, uma agenda cultural do Partido Socialista Italiano, que nesse momento envolve diversos intelectuais, artistas e críticos de arte. Ele nomeou vários nomes aqui, para quem estuda um pouco arte do período e arte na Itália, são nomes hiper conhecidos, né, como aquele Bonito Oliva ou Renato Barilli, né, e como isso foi um momento, inclusive, de uma tentativa de uma entrada na política institucional, a artista tendo, inclusive, se candidatado com esse partido, né, partido que depois vai ter o seu fim histórico com a operação lá de Tangentopoli, das Manipoliti, que vai... que todos vocês já ouviram falar um pouco dessa história, porque vocês sabem que serviu de modelo para um certo juiz brasileiro aí fazer algumas ações, né, políticas semelhantes contra os partidos de esquerda no país. Muito bem. Então, dito isso, eu vou voltar aqui. Agora vocês têm todos os elementos para preparar questões, e eu vou voltar rapidinho para o inglês para poder fazer umas 2 perguntinhas aqui para ele. So, Jacopo, I gave them a brief, not so brief, summary of your talk in Portuguese.
I could follow, yeah.
But I want to ask you a couple of things, and then I'll move to the audience. One thing that I found particularly interesting was the fact that their action in the 1978 Venice Biennale seems quite interesting. Well, it already shows that they were in this movement of being accepted into the mainstream of the art circuit. But it's very interesting because we were talking before the talk, we were discussing the thing with ecology and the current trends around ecology. And this is a Biennale who had ecology as a theme, because it's the moment, 1978 is the moment where this is making surface, right? The debate around ecology from 73 to 78 is the rise. And but it's very desculpa se não tô ouvindo. Sempre lembro. Não é unidirecional o nosso microfone, é isso. No, mainly, yes, actually. So this 1978 Biennale with this theme on nature. So the idea of nature, that from our present day perspective, when we talk about nature, it seems that we are always talking about a positive thing, right? So nature would be the opposite of capital, nature would be the opposite of pollution or destruction, nature is something to be defended, etc., etc. But here in this 1978 Biennale, which was partially connected with the rise of discussion around the question of ecology, nevertheless, what they presented was, on their perspective, nature was a way of, naturalizing the role of women in society. So they locked nature on the outside because they didn't want to be reduced as the nature counterpart of work, right? So from their gender perspective, nature was not a positive pole. So this is the first thing I would like you to comment on. And the second thing is your provocation about 77 as the first precarious work revolt.
I think, thank you for this question, because I didn't really think of that connection in these terms, but you're right. I mean, 1978 is often remembered as the Biennale of Feminism, but it's more than that. There's more to it, and it's really about the environmental condition and a possible connection. But this is just an hypothesis between women and nature, and I think they are reacting to what is maybe somewhere in the text or the catalog, or because many female artists were invited, but the topic was a very risky one. I think thinking of the Biennale of 2022, so the last Biennale, I mean, the new one has just opened. I think some of these dichotomies are still quite productive. And of course, the debate has changed a lot. But yeah, I mean, this kind of connection between women and nature was, at least I sensed it 2 years ago as a very problematic one. Of course, it's I mean, this is one of the most problematic aspects, I think, of ecofeminism, when ecofeminism suggests this kind of, you know, intimate connection between women and nature. I think this is kind of risky. And I think that the way to approach this problem was extremely clever. And yeah, 1977, I mean, as I said, it's a provocation because it's also a movement that is very much connected to the history of the workers' movement, of the factories. So it's not only a movement of precarious workers. But I think what makes it interesting today is the radicality of these unemployed people or precarious people, including people working in the cultural industry that began, I mean, they began representing a significant segment of the market in Rome and Milan, mostly in Bologna to a certain extent. And you have people working in the cultural industry that say, you know, you let us work for free in even, you know, in the leftist festivals, people work for free. They are paid through the kind of, you know, the praises of militancy. Basically, they were using arguments that were derived from the Wages for Housework campaign. You know, we are working for free for the glory of being, you know, of the left. And this is what feminists were saying, you know, we're working for free in exchange of love and affection, but this is just bullshit. So this is, you know, so I think it's very interesting how the feminist is, well, how the second wave also was appropriated by this movement. Second wave of feminism, of course. So some ideas shifted to others, you know, forms of activism and nourish them, really. And I think it's a movement that still has something to say. Also, if you look at the arts, I mean, I mentioned it briefly, but in 1977, the word creativity is meant to be the opposite of art. Art is seen as something that appropriates the kind of collective creativity that emerges out of a movement. And I think we need to kind of recover that conflictual dimension of creativity as something plural and collective.
But if I understood you correctly, the metaphor you're doing, the comparison you're doing between 77 and precarious workers today, it's mainly about feminism in 77.
No, but 1977 is a movement that encompasses many sub-movements. But I actually see similarities in the way in which feminist discourse is appropriated in different fields. In the cultural industry. I mean, obviously many women work in the culture industry, but I think some of the arguments that are mobilized by some activists come originally from feminism. You know, the issue of unpaid labor, really. And this is also why I think the Wages for Housework campaign has been reassessed. And Gabriel told me that everyone reads Silvia Federici now in Brazil. Yeah, she's the product of this second wave. But the Wages for Housework, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Wages for Housework campaign was a minuscule part of second wave feminism. So it was not mainstream at all. So the fact that it's been rediscovered suggests that it was forgotten in a way. That if Federici republish or publish an updated version of a 1980s book in 2006, I think, in English, it means that nobody was reading this book in the 90s. Nobody is obviously a bit strong, but there's been a gap in the movement.
Right. And also something I commented on here in Portuguese when I was given the summary, the fact that you told me that also Gandini, when you first approached her, she was practically forgotten. Right?
Yeah, this is something I like to tell because it's a funny story, I think, and it's also kind of revealing and possibly useful for some students. When I began carrying out research for my book, at some point I realized that there were virtually no women. Now there were some female theorists, but no artists and architects. And so I was, I was kind of gutted, but I just thought, well, if there are no women, there are no women. And then actually, and so, well, I think some of you know this kind of feeling. And then I asked an activist, Leopoldina Fortunati, if she knew some artists, please give me some female artists, of course. And she said, yeah, there was someone. And she came up with this name, Gandini something. Okay. And quite luckily, Gandini's daughter was and is in the art world. And she has the name of her mother, so it's quite recognizable. And so I got in touch with her, and she was very helpful. And then through her, the whole story began, because I started really making phone calls, because most of these artists, if they're still alive, of course, don't use the email. Some of them are almost 90. And so like back 2017, 16, yeah, I just went to their place. I just had them keep, of course, the very old and often actually lonely people divorced from their husbands. That helped them find materials and try to kind of piece the story together, because nobody had really focused on their work since then. So they were at first quite skeptical, and then very helpful, and even, I would say, even passionate about the work I was doing, to a point where they thought, well, we should write, rightly so, of course, our own story. And also some of them publish a sort of, small book of memories, and they publish some of their archives. So this is something that I contributed to kind of emerge in a way. It was quick, but yeah, it worked out.
Você não quer falar inglês?
We know. I'm afraid you won't understand me because. No, I wonder if I should speak Portuguese. I think, né? Eu acho que eu devia falar em português, né? Ele traduz. You're the translator, please. Will you help me? Não, é muito simples. It's very simple. Eu só queria contar da minha experiência de pesquisa com o movimento operário do Brasil no início do século XX, quando começa a industrialização em São Paulo, que é onde começa a industrialização no Brasil. E eu estudei os anarquistas. E, para o meu grande espanto, isso era o ano de 1980, quando eu vim fazer mestrado aqui. Eu tinha feito história, depois eu fiz filosofia, e aí eu encontrei meu colega de graduação da história, lá da USP, que me chamou para vir aqui fazer pós. E eu fiz concurso, e entrei, e fui estudar os anarquistas aqui no arquivo Edgar Loenrot. E, para o meu grande espanto, eram mais mulheres que homens, o proletariado brasileiro, do início do século XX. E eu falei, então devia chamar proletariada, né? Eu não estava com feminismo na cabeça, eu estava com um imigrante português italiano, bigodudo, tipo os meus parentes italianos, né? Nas fábricas, entendeu? Quando eu começo a ler a imprensa operária, que vocês encontram aqui no arquivo Edgar Loenrot, maravilhosa. 1901, 1902, 1904, Terra Livre, a Lanterna, né? A Plebe. O que eu encontro? Mulheres. Aí eu fui ver as fichas dos indesejáveis que eles mandavam embora porque faziam greve. E só tinha mulher, a Angelina, de 15 anos, 16 anos. o proletariado não só não tinha bigode, como era mulher e criança. Entendeu? Então, isso me levou a estudar temas femininos. Não porque eu estivesse ligada, mas porque as mulheres escreviam nos jornais. E sobre o que elas escreviam. Então, para o meu grande espanto, imagina, em 1980, eu chego lá e tem assim, a greve operária dos trabalhadores da fábrica, em 1904. Do lado tinha o prazer sexual das mulheres. Abaixo o casamento monogâmico indissolúvel. Escrito por mulheres em 1902, 3, 4. Aí eu falei assim, os anarquistas defendem o amor livre, libero amore, não? Free love. Kiss defend free love. And I thought, what are they meaning by free love? What is this? E eles estão criticando a rainha do lar. A mulher do lar que nasce, para vocês saberem, quem não sabe, é do século XIX, não é do século XVI nem XVII. Então, eu fiquei muito espantada com os temas of sexuality in the Workers' Journal of the beginning of the century, of the 20th century. And then I met this famous anarchist woman, Brazilian, Maria Lacerda de Moura, que em 1924 publicou um livro criticando o famoso Cesare Lombroso, nome de rua de São Paulo, que dizia que a prostituta é uma mulher de quadril grande, é uma degenerada nata. Pode notar que quem nasceu com quadril grande vai ser prostituta. Aí eu fiz um doutorado sobre a history of prostitution in Brazil. Same period. Entenderam? Então, a Maria Lacerda de Moura também vocês encontram no arquivo Edgar Lenrot, não vão comprar nas livrarias. O Lombroso vocês acham, ela não. O livro se chama A Mulher é uma Degenerada? 1924. 1932, she writes, Love, but do not multiply. Amai e não vos multipliqueis. Obviamente, ela está criticando o cristianismo. Just to tell you a little bit of my research.
The topic, I mean, this is that was in the images more than in my talk, but the topic of sex work was also a prominent aspect of this current of feminism, which was debated at the time, but has become much more important by now, of course. And when you talk about the labor of love, and Fortunati, it was in the subtitle of a book, also wrote about sex workers. This is one of the other connections that can be outlined between this current and today.
Só mais uma coisa que eu queria trazer. Eu queria também trazer a diferença da Itália para o Brasil. Porque o Brasil, nessa época que ele está falando, as brasileiras se inspiravam muito nas italianas, na luta otomana, no movimento feminista europeu, não é? Na Itália, sobretudo, porque aqui era a ditadura militar acabando. Na segunda metade da década de 70, todo mundo já sabia que ia acabar e o papo era, vai acabar. E aí explodiram os chamados novos movimentos sociais. E o feminismo foi a liderança desses novos movimentos sociais. Então, é muito diferente a luta lá e aqui, porque aqui tinha a ver com conquistas contra a ditadura. Não era só uma luta de mulheres conseguindo espaço. Tanto que o movimento feminista começa nos meios operários. O grupo de feministas vai para os meios... Quer dizer, primeiro ele tem um grupo de feministas das universidades, ex-presas políticas, exiladas, que depois falam, nós temos que ir para as periferias, para os sindicatos, para as universidades. A história das mulheres é da década de 80, né? A gente não tinha passado. Não é? E sem passado, você não tem história. História é liberdade, porque a história mostra que alguma coisa nasceu em algum momento. Se nasceu em algum momento, pode morrer. Isso o Foucault me ensinou. Se a prisão nasceu no século XIX, ela pode deixar de existir. Não é necessidade. Destino é uma mentira, não existe.
Ho capito.
But something but what she was telling, that she found all these references in the anarchist movement of the beginning of the 20th century. This made me think, is this something that this feminist movement from 70s and 80s, were they aware of this past? Would they evoke this Italian anarchist?
I don't think so. No, I mean, whether they were aware or not is obviously a different question, but I couldn't find direct reference in the text. They were more interested, especially this kind of feminism, this kind of Marxist feminism in America, in the kind of, the policies of the New Deal in the 30s. Why? Because Italy had a sort of relatively progressive social policy that was meant to kind of integrate that was at least the idea of this kind of Marxism, to integrate the workers' movement, and of course also its female components within capitalist accumulation. And so they were looking for models in the US, in the struggles of the 20s and 30s, which were sometimes anarchist struggles. But I didn't quite look at Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. And anarchism is quite absent from the kind of background, I think.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I will ask something in Portuguese and we can translate together. Eu estava pensando, se eu bem compreendi no final da sua apresentação, se existe alguma relação da Gandini com a emergência do feminismo da diferença. I don't know if you can cross the work about Gandini with the feminist of difference, like Cigarini, Luisa Muraro. Por quê? Porque na Livraria de Mulheres de Milão, esse grupo que a gente no Brasil conecta com o que eles chamam na Itália e na França de feminismo da diferença, e nos Estados Unidos vem o termo gênero para falar de algo similar, digamos assim, elas estão falando muito da importância de ver a perspectiva feminina da sexualidade, e elas não reconhecem o prazer ou o amor como trabalho, né? É uma visão muito radicalmente diferente do que seria uma visão marxista. Então, I don't know if you can explain to us these connections. Ele falou algo também sobre, se eu bem compreendi, uma compreensão de que a Gandini teria feito um trabalho pós-feminista depois de um certo período de conexão com o Partido Socialista. I don't know if I understand correctly, but you used this term post-feminist art correctly. I don't know how we can understand this perception about sobre uma ruptura no pensamento dela. You can explain to us why you use or why you explain this like a rupture in this poetic.
I understood your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so first of all, this is an interesting connection and something I could barely explore, because there's very little written about the debates and perhaps tensions between these different groups. So, for example, I don't know whether you are familiar with the work of Carla Lonzi. Carla Lonzi is a very prominent, first of all, art critic, and then feminist activist, one of the most celebrated feminist activists in Italy. And she was mostly active in the 60s and 70s. And so I asked some of these artists you were in Varese, not far from Varese. Lonzi was in Milan. Did you meet her? Did you read her? I also asked Federici, what did you think of Carla Lonzi? And they were all very, and this, I think this is interesting also from a historical perspective, because you might look at the text and look for some different theoretical different similarities, points of contact, but the reality is sometimes rather, more kind of simple. And they said, they were snobby, they were from Milan, we were from Varese, we were the provincials. They talk about psychoanalysis. I could never really understand Lacan. And, so sometimes the differences and similarities are maybe something that concerns historians more than the actual protagonist, because of some of these reasons, they may not have sought a dialogue. And the same applies to and your team and the group. I don't think there were stable connections or a form of dialogue between them. And Federici told me, yeah, of course, we read Lonzi, yeah, but that was it. And then post-feminism applies in this case to the 80s in Italy, a time when, as weird as it might sound today, the word feminism was often seen as too aggressive, too militant, to don't call me a feminist, and the case of Gandini is, in this sense, a way to cope with the end or the perceived end of a social movement, while keeping that kind of sensibility. But if you read her text, as early as 81, that she says, I'm no longer a feminist. Although her work, in my view, is still informed by feminism. But to her, being a feminist in 81 would have meant that kind of militancy that she wanted to leave in her past, So in this sense, I think it's a form of post-feminism, but relating to the 70s feminism.
Ok. Vamos lá. Quem mais gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, ou comentário, ou observação, ou crítica?
I have a question for the audience, because this is something I find it very interesting, and I was not aware of it, that the condition of female workers actually worsened in the 60s in Italy. And this is something that you will rarely find in the books, because the narrative is Italy became an industrial country, migrants moved from the south to the north. But what you realize is that you have the birth of the Italian housewife as a figure that exists precisely because the man earns a bit more and can afford to have a housewife. Was not a bourgeois figure. When I talked about these topics in the US, the word housewife is connoted as middle class, but this is not the case in Italy. A housewife could have been a working class woman with 6 children, and so I wanted to ask how the situation was in Brazil, if industrialization was parallel with the phenomenon of housewifeization or not. It's a difficult question, I suspect.
Quando parli di housewife in Italia, casalinga. Non quello che hanno voluto chiamare operaio, sarebbe casalinga in generale.
Sim.
Seria dona de casa aqui para nós. Vocês viram, né, o que acontece? Vocês demoraram a fazer uma pergunta, ele fez uma pergunta para vocês. Agora vocês vão ter que responder. Então a pergunta dele, ele disse que ele ficou surpreso, né, ao estudar esse período e perceber que, na verdade, essa figura da dona de casa, ela se constitui se constitui de maneira mais forte nesse período que ele estudou, em parte por conta do período do milagre econômico, que permite que o marido empregado possa, né, não necessitar do sustento do segundo trabalho, né, e a mulher possa ficar em casa. Ele queria saber se no Brasil é a mesma coisa, se tem alguma diferença nesse processo.
Porque o capitalismo urbano industrial é um modelo construído pela burguesia, que não cria só uma questão de relação econômica, ela cria um modelo de masculinidade e feminilidade contra a sociedade aristocrática de corte. O homem da corte era colorido, se pintava, tinha
Margarete,
o homem burguês é monocromático.
não quer falar aqui no microfone?
E a mulher era também do lado. O livro que o feminismo mais conhece da francesa Elisabeth Badinter. O mito do amor materno. L'amour impossible.
L'amour impossible.
Em português é o mito do amor materno. Em francês é o mito do amor materno. Elisabeth Badinter, 1995. C'est le livre de votre époque. Written on the history of the peninsula.
But I mean, the model of femininity, yes, but if you look at Northern Europe, for example, you have more and more women entering the market, so not staying at home. And like now, I mean, this is more common, outsourcing, house labor through, people from India, in the UK, for example, or this kind of, this was what I was asking, but whether
Give this number that the number of women working decreased after 59.
Yes.
Right? After 1959.
I mean, they're still working, but they're not officially working. They're working as housewives.
Ok. Eu acho que ele tá mais, ficou mais surpreso com esse dado que ele achou do trabalho feminino fora de casa ter caído após 59. But I thought that maybe also in the case of Europe specifically, this could be related to the aftermath of the World War.
Yeah.
Like you had to have more women working because a lot of men lost part of the male workforce. And then after 59, maybe this is kind of recomposed.
But I think it was also seen as a value that women, have an income, go to work as a form of emancipation to be part of the workforce. And in Italy, it's quite surprising because it's not really the case. I mean, for whatever reason. But yeah, surely in Europe, it's related to the war as well, yeah.
Professora de História do Brasil. Então, ele falou, especificamente esse momento do final da década de 50 até a década de 70, de ter um decréscimo do número de mulheres trabalhando fora de casa, desse trabalho ser internalizado de novo para dentro de casa. Ele achou esse dado surpreendente na Itália. Eu não sei, até perguntei para ele se isso poderia ter a ver com o período pós-guerra, né, do fato de você ter tido um aumento da mão de obra feminina no lugar da mão de obra masculina que morreu, né, na guerra, substancialmente, e isso se recompor em 59, mas ele não ficou convencido com a minha hipótese, né, porque até ele acha que nesse contexto já era um valor a atuação social feminina, mas isso não bate com o número, e ele não bate com esse número que ele achou, e ele ficou curioso se o Brasil apresentar algo semelhante. Agora o Brasil, né, o Brasil...
Sem ser especificamente, né? Mas eu acho que a gente tem que pensar que quando entra o modelo da rainha do lar na Europa ao longo do século XIX, né? E ele cresce com a urbanização, que é louco, né? Que a urbanização traz a questão da prostituição. Quer dizer, eu não fui estudar prostituição para entender isso da prostituição. A minha questão era por que se fala tanto da prostituição no período da urbanização? Qual que é o objetivo? Dizer para as mulheres castas, qual é o lugar dela e que roupa ela deve usar para não serem confundidas. Isso Alain Coban, na França, Judith Walker nos Estados Unidos, eu no Brasil, teve uma historiografia da sexualidade discutindo porque um tema fica importante numa época se existe prostituição em outra. Tem a ver com o nascimento da rainha do lar, com o doutoramento da mulher do lar, no momento da urbanização, quando se abre a porta do mercado e da vida social brasileira. Né? Agora, nós temos que pensar que 30, 40 são anos de fascismo, franquismo, totalitarismo, fim das mulheres livres da Revolução Espanhola, de 36 a 39. Revolução Espanhola, o franquismo acaba. Mussolini, Hitler, aqui, integralismo, tudo. Quando que vai explodir? Década de 60. Revolução sexual dos anos 60, que a Silvia Federici condena. Ou sem importância. Mas, gente, me desculpe, eu tenho 75 anos. Em 1970, eu tinha 20. Não existia a palavra gay. Como você chamava o que não era homossexual? Não vou falar perfeito. Né?
Come si chiamava? Chi non era eterosessuale?
Movimento gay,
No, non c'è.
Anche io vedo una parola. No,
Non c'era una parola.
io posso pensare a qualche parola.
Mas sabe, quer dizer, entendeu? Quer dizer, você negar para o sexual. Quer dizer, as mulheres não conheciam um pouco. Feminismo veio e disse assim: você sabe como se diz? Fala para ele como se diz abnegada em italiano.
Abnegada.
Abnegada. Não sei.
Eu sei, abnegada.
Abnegada.
Sabe como se diz em inglês? Selfless. Selfless. Sem eu. Ou seja, sem nada, né? E as mulheres, quando estão caindo lá, não aristocrata. A rainha do lar, a partir do século XIX, foi educada a ser selfless. Sem eu. Felizmente, eu sou da geração que aprendeu o feminismo.
Mas eu acho que esse contexto do qual ele falou aqui tem uma demanda nesse sentido também, né? Embora eu acho que esse contexto do qual ele está falando, a gente pode confirmar com ele, mas há uma demanda, eu pelo menos o que eu conheço do movimento de 77, é um movimento que tem uma relação muito parecida com 68, né? E ele mostrou para a gente justamente uma contraposição desse feminismo que ele está mostrando, desse grupo Imagine, com a versão católica e tal, né? Da imagem feminina.
Uma migração para a cidade, uma porcentagem de 70% da população brasileira vivendo no rural nos anos 30, mas local no urbano até o final dos anos 60. Nessa mudança da cidade, é o que vai acontecer no Brasil. O entrada dos meios mais forte, a televisão, é a cultura francesa que vai ser substituída pelo meio online. Então, vão entrar as pressões pelos produtos de consumo e a versão, digamos assim, meio capenga, que seria a mulher do lar, que já é trabalhadora no Brasil, mas ela é trabalhadora do campo, sem ter outras fábricas, mas sem necessariamente ter essa diferença cultural norte-americana ou europeia. Então, eu acho que as pessoas não têm noção de que o rádio chega no Brasil nos anos 30, nos anos 40, que vai entrar mais forte do que é a feminilidade. O governo Vargas vai colocar novamente a igreja tem que construir a cidadã, e tem que construir a mulher que vai educar o cidadão da pátria. E aí ele entra essa narrativa, digamos assim. É o que ocorre.
Mas eu acho que isso é um fenômeno transnacional também, né? Não é muito diferente.
Eu acho que tem esse impacto de não vai acontecer no Brasil, vai ter uma grande migração mudança natural, uma explosão demográfica, uma explosão demográfica no Brasil. E aí, entendeu? A entrada das mulheres é muito forte na caixa de trabalho. Mesmo com o imaginário da mulher doméstica. Então, enquanto os anos 50 no Brasil chega a regular é consolidar no Brasil, no estado de aristocrática e tal, depois elas vão se dissipar também no quê? Aí a mudança das mulheres, além dessa estrutura, não sei se está acho que nesse sentido, não é a gente tem que discutir com a sociologia, porque acho que não se prepara. Uma perda de mercado de trabalho no Brasil para as mulheres. Pelo contrário, chega na cidade, desenvolvimento, principalmente ditadura.
Eu ainda acho esse dado curioso, porque o contexto italiano é parecido.
É parecido. Dado tem a ver com o que é a entrada na carteira de trabalho.
Pode ser.
E aí, o que eu acesso a CLT no Brasil? Não tem CLT cultural, não tem CLT para um fundo precarizado, né? Quando destaca, as mulheres domésticas têm direito à regulamentação do trabalho em 2013. Então, é uma coisa assim, não talvez a documentação não dê conta necessariamente das estatísticas. É nesse sentido que eu estou falando, né? A diferença.
O Zé Maria está nos lembrando aqui que a gente deveria falar sempre no microfone, porque senão não vai para a transmissão, né, Zé Maria? Não, tudo bem. Bom, menos o que eu vou comentar para ele, acho que eu posso fazer para o microfone. Capito também.
Nesse senso, arrivati immigrati e sono entrati nel mondo del lavoro, una cultura lavorale.
Sì, esatto.
Bisognerebbe capire se le diventano delle casalinghe.
Forse una cosa che cambia anche qua è il fatto che c'è molto lavoro domestico sottopagato, con eredità delle schiavitù.
Certo.
Quindi,
come gli Stati Uniti.
Ok, vamos seguir adiante.
C'è una domanda.
Como eu faço? Será que eu desço aqui?
Obrigado.
Você pode traduzir para ele, por favor? A gente ficou com uma dúvida aqui, se a relação de trabalho doméstico com essa retribuição no amor, ela demonstra mais um aspecto da sexualização feminina mesmo, ou seria algo mais relacionado à passividade e à visão da mulher como mãe? Ou é algo que não teria como apontar diretamente assim?
I think the slogan "Even love is domestic labor" was meant as a provocation, and the whole idea is that you need to see the material dimension of affections and love and sex, of course. So I think the whole point, and this is, I guess, a legitimate way to see also aspects of this movement, is to see how it contributes to the emergence of a new image of women. And in the early 60s, women, it's cis women, which today we would say cis women. So I think the whole point was to kind of disconnect love and affection as something inherently feminine, and sexuality also as a result of love and affection, as something. And this stereotype still exists, I guess, in our culture, that, you know, of course, women, you know, tend to have more feelings, to connect sexuality to feelings, and so on and so forth. So I think it's also, yeah, it's a movement that wants to depict a different figure of the woman. And yeah, so I don't know if this answers your question.
Sim. Obrigado. Mais alguém?
Hi. In some point, you showed some stitches of motherhood, and then it reminded me of a feminist collective that Luana introduced to me, which was, I don't know how to speak Spanish, Povo de Galina. I don't know, it's Monica Mayer and Maris Bustamante. Gallina Negra. And it reminded me that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, feminist movements in art in different parts of the world were thinking of the same themes. And even though the artist that you showed was rooted in the Italian context, I would like to know how these feminist artists in Italy were connected to other feminist artists in the same period in different parts. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
also in Chile, the arpilleras
Yes,
also
yes.
work on so similar themes. So,
Yes. Like, were they officially connected, and were they institutionally exchanging ideas, or was just something that was in the air and was shared somehow?
my sense, my gut feeling is not really. Do not forget, these are housewives, so they have to struggle to leave the house. And meeting other, you know, spending a night with some friends because we have a political meeting was very suspicious for most of our husbands. So I don't think that they had time, energy, and also most of them, although not all of them, had children, two to five, I think. Was very difficult just to have basic knowledge of what was happening in Milan. Then, of course, the similarities are probably not. I mean, there must be some reasons why they use similar materials like stitching. So maybe there's more to it, but it's very difficult for me, or it was difficult for me, to trace a direct connection. However, what I can tell you is that one of these, the actually older group member, who is still alive, she's about 94 now, used to work in, what's it called in English? An asylum for mentally ill people in the 60s. And she told me, I began working with stitches because it was quite interesting to see how these women who had, you know, colors, pencils, canvases, did not want to use them. They wanted to use to, you know, to make clothes. And so she was, actually this was a voluntary work she was doing. She was meant to help them paint, and they didn't want to paint. So she thought that as an artist, she had to integrate this kind of attitude in her own work, and also indirectly to question painting as a more noble activity than stitching. So, but it's a very interesting question because of the coup in Chile, many people moved from Chile to Europe and also to Italy, and the Biennale was devoted this year. The anniversary of the Biennale devoted to Chile in 1974. It would be interesting to find out more about women moving from Chile to Italy, for example. But I don't know.
Posso? I try to speak English, but sorry, I'm not too good.
No, try in Portuguese, please. Let's not have English colonize.
No, but it's okay. I think. Tá. Mas depois eu posso tentar traduzir. Enquanto eu estava ouvindo sua pesquisa, eu até conversei aqui, eu lembrei muito de uma artista italiana de Turim, que a gente viu bastante, né, que a Margarete trouxe para nós no grupo, que é a Carol Rama. Carol Rama, I don't know how to pronounce it in Italian.
Carol Rama.
Carol, oh my God. E me veio muito ela na mente, porque comparando ela com a Gandini, eu percebo que elas têm formas muito diferentes de trabalhar essa questão do erotismo, da sexualidade e do desejo nas obras, né? Porque a Gandini, ela traz, né, muito esse debate, como, né, estava na palestra, né, dessa questão do amor e da relação conjugal como trabalho, enquanto a Carol Rama, ela vai para a exploração do erótico como uma certa irreverência, né, como uma certa resistência. E querendo ou não, por mais que a Carol Rama seja mais velha, ela também vai explodir nos anos 80, né, nas exposições lá na Itália. Então, querendo ou não, elas estão ali produzindo em épocas parecidas, por mais que a Gandini seja de uma geração posterior. E aí eu fiquei pensando, né, se esse diálogo não acontece com outros grupos, algo similar ao que a Carol Salve está perguntando, esse enfrentamento de visões diferentes do erótico, de produção diferente do erótico, formas diferentes, o que vai também na direção do que a Luana estava perguntando, né, de que para alguns campos do feminismo que estão nascendo, especialmente nos anos 70 na Europa, como o feminismo da diferença, esse erótico, ele extrapola, né, essa questão do aprisionamento conjugal, né. Então, é um pouco nessa direção que eu queria saber, se tem algum tipo de documentação que mostra esse tipo de debate da Gandini, ou se tem algum tipo de circulação que ela está próxima de artistas como a Carol Rama, ou afastada, algo nessa direção. Do you want me to try to translate?
No.
It's
I
okay?
think I understood.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, Carol Rama is slightly older, I think. And not necessarily connected to the feminist movement. I think I see some of the similarities you mentioned, but I don't know. It's hard for me to tell you something, because I think sometimes I have the impression that looking at the references from an art historical perspective might be misleading, because we look for references that are our own in the art world, but they were not part of the art world. In fact, in 1978, so this is a question I asked myself quite late, and this also reveals my bias. I wonder, sorry, but how many exhibitions did you have before being invited to the Venice Biennial? And they said 4 in a library, in a feminist center, Mama's Gone Out, and 2 other places where we knew some people. And so after 4 exhibitions that were not even in a gallery, you were invited to the Venice Biennale. How's that possible? Well, so the reality was that one of the activists of the Wages for Hours Work campaign was the first wife of De Michelis, so one of these politicians I mentioned, who was still very young at the time. So even if they might seem to belong to the art world, the Venice Biennale, in fact, they were absolute, amateur. And they later wanted to become artists because they realized that the art world is kind of welcoming in a way. So I don't know whether they were familiar with Carol Rama. It seems weird if they had not been familiar with Carol Rama, but it's absolutely possible. And in fact, some of the the interlocutors like Bruno Munari, very famous artist, were actually people from Milan. So they're very local. So I don't know if, I mean, like someone like Carol Rama or, I'm so bad at names, another artist who was very close to Carla Lonzi, well, I forgot her name now. There were female artists who actually had their background in post-war Italy. So rather different generation. Also, often, I don't know, might be the case of Carlo Rama, I don't know, communist of the Communist Party, so very different from this autonomous, or rather autonomist militants. The Communist Party obviously had a policy for female artists, and which was and still is, I mean, for a long time it still was, the idea that, women have to become artists like men, but they weren't into, these topics. Well, but this could be a long discussion, but I think it's a different way of thinking of female work in the art world.
Alguém?
There's also a quite interesting, I mean, if you have a look at my book, quite interesting debate about the space of the house, how a flat, actually more than house, should look like to diminish, or rather to make housework visible. Because one of them was an architect, and I barely mentioned it now, but quite understandably, architecture played a role in their discussions, because this is the ultimate place where this form of exploitation takes place. So they wanted to devise different forms of, spaces, really.
I didn't say, but thank you.
As obras, por exemplo, sobre o Renoir, se na percepção dele as obras que trouxe aqui sobre Renoir ou outros artistas, se ele considera que visualmente elas seriam uma poética feminista, uma forma feminista de expressão artística. Porque há uma coisa que talvez eu fiquei em dúvida um pouco, sim, ela é uma artista que está elaborando uma pauta militante, e nem sempre no Brasil, por exemplo, isso é muito comum, uma artista que se expressou por meio de uma poética feminista foi filiada à militância clássica política, e isso causou muita confusão para as historiadoras feministas da arte, porque elas falavam, bom, mas ela fala, não, eu não sou feminista porque eu nunca fui na militância. E, obviamente, a gente começou a observar que não se tratava disso, porque havia muitas formas de politização do cotidiano, que não necessariamente a militância clássica ou partidária. Então, acho que essas imagens, principalmente, me causaram um pouco de incompreensão, se essas leituras são, por exemplo, uma crítica ao cânone, ou um elogio, ou uma releitura, ou uma citação das obras masculinas, ou se a gente poderia associar, por exemplo, com as críticas as obras de arte canônicas de artistas feministas, não sei, a Cindy Sherman, ou na Argentina, que eu estudei muito, a Nicola Costantino, e outras que usam os artistas masculinos canônicos na forma de crítica ou de ironia para, de alguma forma, desestabilizar o olhar patriarcal. Então, se você puder também explorar um pouco isso, porque a pergunta que eu fiz inicialmente a respeito de se ela poderia ser considerada pós-feminista, ela entra um pouco por essa preocupação que eu estou trazendo aqui. Sim, ela é pós-feminista se você considerar que ela é feminista ligada a uma militância política e ali acabou ou se encerrou a relação dela com aquele grupo, então ali ela já não é mais feminista. Mas você falou a palavra sensibilidade, que é o que eu acredito que está conectando a minha pergunta com essa nova colocação.
I think it's very difficult to generalize, and also precisely because these artists have not been studied, or their work is partly in the archives and destroyed, so it's very difficult to make a general statement. But I think you can probably say that in the mid-70s, they kind of they try to stick to a rather operaista approach, in which feminism, we can probably say they made a feminist critique of the history of art. So stitches, new materials were not just a way to insert a feminist topic in the history of art, but rather a way to feminist critique of the history of art. So what is the history of art? Well, for example, not painting, which was still seen as, the most noble form of expression. In the 80s, at least Gandini seems to do something different and to accept the history of art, Klimt, Renoir, and to insert a feminist critique in the canon, rather than questioning the very existence of the history of art as it is, or as it was. And I think the fact that she explicitly refers to male artists rather than female artists of the past is also an attempt to force a canon, provoke, celebrate some artists like Klimt, and their depiction, very problematic, but their depiction of women. So how we can kind of recover some positive aspects of how some male artists depicted women. This is so a different feminist approach, I think, and this is why. But I do believe that she remained, and this is why I showed you the images in which she satirizes these politicians, because I think if you look at the images, you realize that it's not just about celebrating some friends. This is how her daughter initially saw these images. Yeah, she was friends with the minister, look, but this is not really about her friendship, because her body's there, she's naked but without the head. So I think it's also a very strong, satire of male power. So in that sense, she was still a feminist. So post-feminist doesn't, it's still a form of feminism that implies some form, a break, as you said. Yeah, I think.
C'è questa cosa anche della citazione che hai fatto, in cui dici che questa leggerezza sarebbe una cosa propria del femminismo. Anche partecipato alla postmodernità, una idea del femminismo, che ci sarebbe una poetica femminista. Lei sembra avere un'idea, un modo di fare arte che sarebbe quello che fa lei, che ha una caratteristica proprio femminile, e forse questo questi ultimi anni c'è il cuore, che ha rappresentato, sarebbe promuovere l'essere femminile, sarebbe rappresentare il cuore.
Yeah. Gabriel was making a very interesting point. I mean, the lightness and irony that she finds in the postmodern, she also identifies them in her work. But again, I think she falls back in a kind of naturalization of femininity. I mean, this is, of course, very risky shift, because she tends to imply that there's something feminine in lightness and irony, you know.
Porque o que eu comentei com ele aqui foi isso, né? Porque a Luana perguntou sobre uma poética, né? Que seria específica, né? Como uma poética feminista. E eu lembrei dessa citação, achei muito interessante essa citação que ele fez da Gandini, falando que elas teriam antecipado o pós-modernismo justamente pela dimensão de humor que tinha no que se fazia, né? A leveza e o humor. E esses últimos exemplos dos políticos representados é um caso evidente de humor, né? Escrachado, né? Mas de maneira sutil, né? Porque certamente eles ficaram felizes com a representação que eles receberam. No primeiro, eu tô aqui, beleza. Exato. Então, enfim, né? Eu achei que era uma observação interessante sobre algo que subsiste ali que lhe seria próprio, né? E que é independente de, porque o caso desses quadros dessas obras que a Luana lembrou, né? Sobre as quais ela perguntou, eu lembro do Renoir, é quase assim uma aplicação mais direta, né? De mostrar, olha, estou me colocando com relação à história da arte e estou devolvendo a voz para a modelo que teve o olhar masculino que a dominou. Está muito dentro do debate daquele momento. Esses últimos exemplos é essa maneira mais sutil, né? Tem um meandro ali que passa por outros caminhos que acho que são esses da leveza e do humor que ela falou, que acho que valia salientar. Eu vou passar a palavra para mais uma pergunta e aí a gente pode encerrar, acho, né?
But by the way, I really like these works, which are about the model, and basically the question is, can we see the worker beneath the nude? I think it's an interesting question.
Posso falar português? Já que tá todo mundo falando. Acho que é melhor português.
Português.
Posso falar em português, professor? Eu fiquei... Vou voltar à obra da Bienal. E acho que são duas coisas. Talvez a primeira eu não tenha entendido direito. Gostaria que você pudesse falar mais sobre como você enxerga, como você vê essa relação mulher-natureza, nessa obra em específica, como um afastamento da mulher em relação à natureza. E pelas outras obras que você mostrou depois, me parece que essa específica da Bienal destoa por ser uma instalação e pelo uso dos materiais das outras. E também queria entender, existem outras obras dela que são instalações e que têm uso desses materiais ou não, ou se é realmente o que eu acho na minha tese, a minha hipótese, de que existe essa tendência nos anos 70 e de que alguns artistas que nunca tinham produzido instalações usando esses materiais vão produzir pela primeira vez e talvez seja só o único momento em que eles produzem e depois eles voltam para uma arte, enfim, pintura ou uma forma mais clássica de escultura. Como você vê isso? E essa primeira parte, então, de como você vê nessa obra específica esse afastamento, talvez esse discurso de um afastamento, né, da mulher em relação à natureza. Como ela negaria isso, o artista?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they really want to emancipate the image of the woman from its connection to nature, if this is the question.
First part of the question. And the materials?
Maybe I understood. They also, it was not in my text, but they also says, something like, and we want to disconnect this analogy also through natural means, like the materials they use, so like cotton or bisso, which is a very precious form of thread, which are originally natural materials. And maybe I don't know exactly what they use, but so I think they try to have a dialectical approach to nature, in which nature can work against itself in a way. So you use nature to go against nature in a way. But it's always kind of implicit. They really talk about abortion. And of course, abortion, when it was still illegal, or maybe when it became legal but not easily accessible, it was often performed through natural herbs or whatever, products that you had to ingest to maybe have an abortion. So I think this the use of natural materials against nature, it's a reference to the title of the Biennale, but it's also a way to talk about abortion. Yeah. No, they didn't use any specific materials for the Biennale. This is the materials were the same they always used in the mid-70s. I didn't explore that in detail, but there were mostly common threads to produce tapestry. One of them said, I use bisso, but I tried to look into it. Bisso is a very precious form of fabric, which is a natural fabric. I don't know, but bisso also has a more kind of this is the original meaning of the word, but I don't know whether she really used a natural coming from fish, I guess. I think she only meant something very precious, not necessarily the more natural material. But this is something we could ask her if you're interested. The topic of nature, I mean, is a very philosophical topic, and it's been very prominent over the past years. It's very interesting to see how, and I guess this is part of your work, how the 70s used the word nature, but in a different way, maybe, and the kind of shifts. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you one last thing?
Sure.
Something that you mentioned in the very beginning, which I think it's very important from conceptual perspective, which would be this contradiction of being against work and wanting a wage. So being a wage campaign, but coming from a movement that saw work as the enemy. So how to deal with this contradiction, also on the view of the present, where we live in precarious situations where we tend to ask for the comeback of work, while it seems this seems impossible.
I think in this Marxist trend, the term refusal of work often meant the refusal of the cult of work as something emancipatory. It was often, and even back then, some people complained about the way in which some activists claimed the refusal of work to smoke joints and do nothing, rather than political struggles. So they said that this is not the refusal of work. But anyway, so it's, as every powerful slogan, opens to several interpretation and appropriations. But I think it's one of the most, I think what I mentioned as the moral value of the well-made, I think this is very much present. Something that this is also perhaps the legacy of the modernist movement. The well-made embodies, encapsulates a form of morality per se. Well, this is something they really wanted to oppose, doing almost proto-punk works that decry the idea that, a well-made work displaying some form of skillful and patient craft is something morally valued. So I think this is something we need to recover, because this is still part of our culture. The well-made as something that has value per se. And then I don't think the refusal of work, I don't know about Brazil, but I think the cult of work is still very, very strong in our culture. The idea that work is something that emancipates, that liberates, something that, produces progress, as in the flag of Brazil, very 19th century idea. I think this is something we still have to counter also through a clever and creative and ironic use of or practice of the refusal of work. I don't know if this answers your question, but it's difficult. I know, because I guess like Gabriel and others, someone who wanted to have a work impossible, was struggling as a precarious work, and the only thing I wanted was a job. And this is the irony of this is the irony of it. And I even said that precisely when, at least in Italy, when you get a job, well, you stop working. So maybe you need to get a job to start to refuse work.
Yeah, that's the best way to put an end to this moment of work and to conclude our conversation today. Queria agradecer novamente ao Jacopo, agradecer a todo mundo que veio hoje pela participação, pelas perguntas, agradecer a nossa linha de pesquisa, a professora Margarete, né, que já trouxe quase uma aula em paralelo aqui para a gente, e que eu esqueci de dar um microfone para ela poder ter a sua fala ali registrada. Mas... Agora? Ah. Então, em seguida, agora com o bolo, a gente canta uma canção.
Thank you so much.